The first of the Gospels, then, we believe, is the Gospel according to Mark. Now, we don't know a huge amount about Mark. In fact, we're not even sure who wrote the Gospel according to Mark, because there is nowhere in it which says, I am the writer and this is who I am. But we know that by already the beginning of the 2nd century, Mark was now seen to be the author of this particular short Gospel. We know from the Gospel that there's some peculiarities about it, particularly in comparison to the other two, to Matthew and to Luke. And of course, the first thing that jumps out at you is that, of course, there is no birth narrative. There's no story about how Jesus is born. In fact, there's no story about him at all until he's an adult, until he actually begins his ministry. And it's only at that point that Mark kicks in. So straight away we realize that Mark is doing something different here. Mark is not wanting to give an apologetic. He's not wanting to give an understanding or an excuse or an argument about who Jesus was, where Jesus came from, who Jesus' family was. He doesn't want to give you any of that information, because as far as he's concerned, it's not important. And that's a very important process to understand for Mark, because straight away you realize that maybe the audience that Mark is writing to doesn't care. That for them, they don't need to be convinced of his ancestry. They don't need to be convinced of his Jewishness. So straight away we can see that maybe it needs to be, or it's written to an audience who, number one, doesn't care about ancestry, and number two, doesn't care about the whole Jewish frame. And so potentially he's writing to Gentiles. On the other hand, he's potentially writing to slaves. Because slaves are ones who don't care about your genealogy. Who cares who a slave's father was? All that you care about is what a slave can actually do. You care about their activity. You care about what they can achieve. And if you look at Mark's gospel as a whole, it's a gospel of action. It's a gospel of action. Now, who was Mark? We don't know. Potentially, Mark is the same as we find about in John Mark, or the concept, or the person called John Mark, which we read about both in Paul's letters and in Luke, or Luke's second section, which is, of course, the book of Acts. And what we find with that is that he began to be, or started off as a companion of Paul, but then stopped being a companion of Paul, and because of some fallout, and we're not quite sure what that is, became a companion of Peter. And so Peter is most probably the first generation source for Mark. Mark wasn't a disciple, so Mark wasn't there to see the things that he talks about, the things that he writes about. And so what we connect with that is that most probably he sees it from Peter's perspective. Now when you look at Peter, you see a man of action, a man who often will speak first and think second, even to the point where Jesus will say to him, "Get behind me, Satan." Because again, he hasn't been talking without listening, without thinking about what Jesus is actually talking about. And so it's a book of action. And so what we see within Mark's gospel, more than we do in the others, is miracles. Miracles. One thing that you want to know as a slave is that Jesus is a person of action and of power, that he can transform the environment as you would know it. It's within Mark's gospel that we see the focus on Jesus, who is the one who is powerful enough to overcome the things of life, to overcome the problems that we would face, who would give hope and connection to people. Again, for people who are slaves, that would be an important thing to hear. We also realize that he's most probably speaking to a more Gentile than Jewish audience by virtue of the fact that there's very little connection with the Old Testament. The Old Testament isn't mentioned very much, and when in fact some Aramaic or Hebrew words are used, the writer always interprets them. So it would say rabbi, which means teacher. Now you can understand that if this is a Jewish environment, you would need to explain what a rabbi was, the people would know. And so we assume, we infer that Mark was written to slaves in a predominantly Gentile environment, most probably in Rome. Now, where was Mark when he was writing? Well, if he was a companion of Peter, he's most probably writing from Judea. We can understand that too by virtue of the fact that it's from Judea that you can see that the language of Mark is written from somebody who is most probably not a Greek speaker, not a natural or first language speaker of Greek. Why? Because of the language of the gospel itself. It uses a very small vocabulary. It uses incorrect grammar, syntax. It even uses the same word in various contexts, even though a better word might exist. All of those tells us that most probably Mark is writing from a Judean perspective, but to the church in the diaspora, the church in the rest of Rome. We also realize that it's most probably then written somewhere around 65 AD. Now, many scholars, or a number of scholars, want to give it a much earlier date, some up to the late 40s. My belief is that it was in the late 60s, so about 65 AD, before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And so probably even written from the center of Christianity, which was Jerusalem at this point, written from there through to the church in the diaspora. We know that it was most probably written to Rome because it gets hold of by people like Matthew and Luke. Luke particularly, who we believe most probably is writing from that Jewish diaspora. Mark's gospel quickly got around. Mark's gospel quickly began to be copied and began to be shared by the rest of the church because it would have been the first systematic story, narrative of the life of Jesus, from that beginning point of his ministry to the end point of the resurrection. And so that gospel message, the message of Jesus being the fulfillment of the good news of the Tanakh, happens in Mark's gospel. And it's in Mark's gospel that we begin to see the process. It's probably written to slaves, because slaves would have been the most receptive to the ministry, most receptive to this new word that was coming into their lives. A word of hope, a word of celebration, a word, an acknowledgement that in fact the Messiah had come. The one that they were waiting for, the one that they were hoping for, had actually come in the person of Jesus. All those things together would have made Mark a tremendous connection for the people.